All right, why don't we get started then? Um, so welcome. Um, and this week we didn't really do anything except the Active Inference Symposium, which was a lot of work on our end. We'll talk about that. I also attended the Neuro AI workshop, so that was part of the week too. We didn't have a DivaWare meeting. And the other meetings we had to postpone because of the workshop and the symposium. So why don't we get into that? I'll review the Active Inference Symposium this week, and then next week I'll talk about the Neuro AI workshop because as much as I've really enjoyed that, I haven't gotten the notes together on that yet. So I've posted the links to the live streams in the general channel. So this is the Active Inference Symposium, and so this is the way it's being presented to the world. So we have actually three live streams. So what Daniel Friedman does, and Daniel Friedman is the person who kind of runs Active Inference Institute. I mean, he's kind of the main person. There are other people involved, but he's like kind of the visionary and the central person and everything. He makes these live streams on YouTube, and so they're varying lengths of time. And this symposium is basically three live streams, two of them being where all the talks are, and then there's another one that's another type of kind of like a workshop or something. These are both 10 hours, more than 10 hours a piece. So I put a disclaimer here, warning, these are like 10 hours a piece. You'll have to browse the streams to find the individual talks. So if you click through, you'll go through and there'll be all these talks and you'll just have to kind of zoom through and find the one. I think there's a plan to annotate the streams later, but I'm not sure, when that's going to happen. Okay, so it was a good time. We were planning on this, and we did some planning ahead of time. We had 4 talks from the group, which is good. A lot of work, um, and I had to get in touch with Stefan Bowman. I had to schedule a time to pre-record, which is fine. It went well, and so we have that talk. Jesse contributed a talk, which didn't make it into the live streams, but we do have it on our YouTube channel. I did one talk on open science and open source, and another talk on cybernetics, the purposefully non-standard cybernetics talk. And that's basically recapping a lot of the stuff from our cybernetics group, some of the stuff from our cognition futures group, and then some additional things included. So let me go to the, let's see. So I've got a bunch of screenshots here. I'll just kind of walk through them. So these are the live streams, part 1 and part 2. Daniel kind of did this courageous task of hosting most of both of them. So it's like these huge, long 12-hour marathon sessions that were, he was emceeing everything, and it was great. I mean, I don't know. I think he had a little bit of help from other people, but we got through it and everything. So we contributed like 3 things to these live streams, but there's so much interesting content in the live streams that I'm going to go over, and I'm just going to kind of scratch the surface of what's there because there's just so much there. There's Carl Friston, and there are other people who are, really kind of central to some of the themes in the Institute over there. So, they're focusing on active inference, free energy principle, and then some other light topics. There are a lot of mathematical topics and software engineering topics, like basically the software that people use to model active inference. And a lot of cybernetic stuff too. I was surprised. Computational stuff and a little bit of educational stuff, but not very much. But anyways, let's go through it. So that's the live streams. This is a shot from one of Carl Friston's. He started sort of kicked off the first live stream with a discussion of the free energy principle and active inference. And he's talking about Maxwell's demon, our favorite demon, where it's talking about active data selection. So in this case, I think he's talking about training a model based on like selecting data in a certain direction. So the idea is that you select data in a certain direction and you can facilitate learning. And so this is what we call active data selection. Does a sequence end in a reward? Yes, admit the sequence for fast structure learning. No, ignore the sequence. Fast structure learning furnishes a generative model of events that lead to a reward and nothing else. And so that's he goes through a lot of that. So that's the first talk in the first live stream. Then there was this talk. I can't remember. Oh, this is in the first live stream as well. Dynamic prior preference learning for scalable, robust, deep active inference. So this is another application to, I guess it's to, no, I don't know if it's deep learning or if it's something that resembles deep learning, but this is a good talk. So this lab here, the Neural Adaptive Computing Lab at Rochester Institute of Technology, that's run by Alexander Arobia. I think we've talked about Arobia in other contexts. And so he runs this lab, and we had a number of talks from that lab. And Arobia is interested in cybernetics, interested in a lot of these type of topics around active inference. And so this person here, they presented on this topic, and it's really interesting stuff. Really interesting stuff. Okay. This is an image of. This is from another talk. This is. I'll get to the title. I think I'll get to the title slide in a little bit. But this is a roboticist. He works in industry, who developed a robotic control system from the homeostat from W.R. Ashby's homeostat, and had a lot of really interesting insights into the good regulator theorem and what Ashby was trying to do with the homeostat and how it connects to modern neural networks. So this is where you have this homeostat, which is the picture up at the top. It's a set of nodes, connections, and weights. And it tries to, instead of selecting for the optimal weights, it selects for the most adaptive weights. It selects for this ultra stability and homeostasis. And then the nodes kind of coordinate themselves in different ways. So they've actually implemented a version of the homeostat for robotic control. And you couldn't get into a lot of the details because some of it's proprietary. But suffice it to say, they're using the good regulator theorem and Ashby's homeostat to kind of applying it in a way that's interesting. This is another slide from the same talk. This is so he talks about the homeostat. He talks about this homeostatic network, and then talks about embodiment because they're applying it to robotics, and gives this example of a network where you have this homeostatic network that's taking information in from sensors, mapping it to motors. So it's like a Bradenburg vehicle type model. And so this is where, this is a kind of a undirected homeostatic network where motor actions and sensor expectations become entrained into the homeostatic self-maintenance process. So again, I was kind of hoping we could find some papers on this, but I don't think they're there, at least not yet. Okay, this one here is a talk. It was actually in part 2, and it was kind of towards the end of the session. This is Andrew B. Pashea, and the talk is Active Inference as a Framework for Social Science Agent-Based Modeling. So this is stuff that the Institute is working on with biofirms. And so it's like this organizational approach that is influenced by active inference and more generally by biological systems. So this kind of goes through some of the stuff that they're doing. You know, it's a long kind of tutorial working on some problems. So this is all in the live stream. This is actually a software called ngc-learn. And so this is something that they've also, I think it's the lab run by Alexander Orobia again. And they did this stuff, ngc-learn, where they kind of implement a lot of things with respect to active inference. So there was a whole tutorial on ngc-learn in the session. I think it was in part 2. And this is, of course, the title slide. Yeah, it is from that lab. This is William Gebhardt, who's kind of maintaining the software. This is an introduction to ngc-learn, a computational neuroscience library. So this is actually for looking at computational neuroscience and active inference. And and he kind of goes through, it's a tutorial in there. This is actually something we were talking about last time. This is RxInfer. So they actually had, in part 2, they had a overview of RxInfer, a library for scalable probabilistic programming. Actually, I think we talked about this last week in the administrative meeting, and so it didn't make it to one of our main meetings, but this is what they were talking about. I don't remember what we were talking about with respect to RxInfer. It was a lot of like, isn't this software cool? Does active inference, it's, but this is a set of libraries you can use for this kind of approach. So we have 2 pieces of software here, ngc-learn and RxInfer. And so those are kind of interesting with respect to this Stefan Bollman talk, because he talked about NeuroDesk. But of course, NeuroDesk is this sort of containerization strategy for software. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. Keep a pin in that. Then, okay, so this is the talk. This is the person who created these, is creating robots inspired by Ashby and inspired by the good regulator theorem. So this is a company called ThoughtForge. This is Matthew Brown. So I think maybe we talked about Matthew Brown. I think Morgan brought him up. But this is real-time active inference for adaptive robotic control. So this is where we have the robotic control. Yeah, when you are able to speak, Morgan, maybe you could tell me a little bit more about this, and because I think we did talk about him, but that's the talk, and that was in part 2 of the live stream. Then in part 1, if we go back to part 1, we have these, what they did with the registration is interesting. Everyone who registered had to fill out some sort of a survey of what they were working on, what they were interested in, and then some of the organizers created these word clouds. So basically, the way a word cloud works is that if you have more mentions of something, it's bigger. Fewer mentions of something, it's smaller. And this is from across, I don't know how many registrants, maybe at least 100, where you have these different interests. And so this is like the personal background of the attendees. So it's AI is a big area, research, computational, psychology, systems, neuroscience, cognitive, philosophy is a little smaller, projects, multi-agent, models. LinkedIn made it in there somehow, I don't know. But, you can see the sort of the areas that people are interested in. It's not surprising, but it's nice to get that sort of feedback about what people are thinking about, why they're coming to a conference, what they want to get out of it, perhaps. So those are all not surprising. Those are all expected categories. And so I'm surprised Brain is so small, but it's an imperfect methodology because people will just put anything in. But anyways, that's for the personal background of the attendees. Then this is, how are you applying active inference? So this is a different question. It's basically not your own background, but how you're applying it, which is maybe a subset of the first question. But so again, we have systems, very large, NN, which I assume is neural network, smaller, AI, theory, which is interesting because that's what we're interested in. You don't think of applying things to theory, but a lot of people in this group do. Research, of course, dynamics, agents, habits. That's interesting. Multi-agent, information, research, of course, model, time, which isn't informative, and processing. So again, nothing really unexpected there. It's really telling us that people are applying things as systems, as applications, of course, something having to do with theory or theoretical, a lot of dynamical systems, cognitive psychology, habits, and then maybe research applications, and even governance is in there. And so this is really this is how serendipitous our contributions were, because we talked about open source and open science, and I gave a talk on that, and it was really kind of fit in. And I didn't even see this word. I think I may have seen it once after I recorded the talk, but it really fit into a number of areas, like governance and systems, and kind of getting the work out there, and software research, software theoretical development. So it was very serendipitous that we did this, and some of the topics we covered. So okay, moving on. In part two was when the NeuroDesk talk happened, and like I said, I had to pre-record it because the time zones were too far off, but that's okay because Stefan, I think, was very generous with his time, very amenable to doing the pre-record. Got him away from like the morning schedule, and it was very well received. I think I pre-recorded it, then we did the live stream. Then Daniel had asked me some really interesting questions. I asked Stefan, first of all, about some of the questions, like he presented on NeuroDesk, which a lot of the work focused on neuroimaging, which is great because there are neuroimaging people in. You didn't see it in the word cloud, but there are a lot of people who are interested in neuroimaging. Carl Friston, of course, made his career on neuroimaging. But, it's like, okay, I said, well, it's a containerization strategy. So how do you apply that to a larger audience? Like, how could I take active inference tools and put them in here? And as it turns out, you can very easily do this. You can very easily customize the NeuroDesk sort of framework. And, that's very much applicable to what people are doing in the Active Inference Institute, some of those software packages I mentioned. The other thing is that, it brought up a lot of interesting questions about replicability and, open science, where, you can just use something in the cloud, or, have a tool that's, gives you some capability as an organization. So it was really interesting stuff. And I think Daniel was really turned on by it in terms of like, how we can take lessons from it. And so that's good. And so, yeah, it was a really good talk. It's on, so I'll show you later, but we have a playlist on our YouTube channel of all the videos as well. This is a fun talk by John Clippinger, or a fun cartoon. I'm sure it was a fun talk as well. This is in part one. So this is a cartoon by Leighton. It's robots whipping humans into submission, making them do work. And it says, to think this all began with letting autocomplete finish our sentences. Which is like, autocomplete is usually, like, it's a very old computer science problem where they tried to, it was very early language modeling with Markov chains, and they basically tried to predict the next state or the next thing in a sequence. And so this is well before large language models. And I just did this in project management. I talked about, the history of like automated code completion. So it's really interesting that this came up. But this is talk Markov chains all the way, and it talks about some Markov chain approaches to active inference. It's an interesting talk. If you're interested in mathematical modeling, it might be something to look into. So another word about this is that in the Active Inference Institute, we have all sorts of people who kind of join in. So we have people who are doing, different projects. Sometimes it's software engineering. Sometimes it's, senior scientists doing like different topics that are relevant to the topic at hand, computational stuff. So you can see that there's this very loose association of people around the institute doing different things that are somewhat relevant to, some of the main projects, but still a very, very fertile intellectual environment. Okay, so now this is our talk on purposefully non-standard cybernetics. So this is where this was in part 1, sort of towards the end of the stream, and highlighting the cybernetic interest group. And it was really well received. I think they really enjoyed it because, like I said, there is this theme of cybernetics in the group. So there were some other talks where they talked about different aspects of cybernetics. And it's interesting, I wouldn't have thought that. I didn't realize that there was such a latent interest in cybernetics in the Institute, but here we are. Ines Hippolito was also there. She did this talk, Dysfunctional Markov Blankets from Stuck States to Adaptation. So this is talking about Markov blankets, which is one of the ideas in active inference. Markov blankets basically serve as the boundary of a system or to delineate the system in some way. And so this was a nice talk. This is at the end of part 1 if you go into the stream. So yeah, it was nice to see. This is our playlist for Active Inference Symposium. So I put together the 4 talks. We have Purposefully Non-Standard Cybernetics. We have the overview of open source and open science. We have Jesse's presentation on management and leadership, on navigation for research plus innovation, and then the NeuroDesk talk, reproducible neuroimaging for everyone. So those are all on the YouTube channel, the Orthogonal Research and Education Lab YouTube channel, not the Active Inference YouTube channel, and it's under Active Symposium. That's the playlist name. Okay, so this is a paper from one of the talks. Actually, this is one of the talks, kind of like the paper for the talk. So this was in part 1. This is it was Mark Miller who gave this talk, and this is the usual suspects in active inference, and then the paper is called Resilience in Active Inference. So it really kind of goes through some complex systems discussions on resilience and other sort of talks, other topics on adaptation and things like that. So that's again kind of uncovering some of those themes that we maybe the casual observer doesn't realize are part of active inference. A lot of stuff having to do with complexity and complexity related topics that are kind of latent and just sitting underneath everything else. But there are things that many things to explore there. This was an interesting talk in part 1. This was Groove is the musical glue for social bonding. This is Leonardo Milo Rodriguez. This is a neuroscientific and cross-cultural perspective. So this is kind of, I guess, applying active inference to music and to music theory. This talk is by Devin Bay. This was in part 2, accounting for multiscalar and conscious psychobiological phenomena in the active inference paradigm. So this is again like thinking about some of the behaviors in some of the maybe not predictive behaviors per se, but just kind of like thinking about the different behaviors that you can have in if you're applying active inference to something. This is the Active Inference Institute YouTube channel. This has the live streams, but also if you go here and subscribe, you'll get updated on their different streams. So they do a lot of different streams, of course. They do the topical live streams. They do the they're writing a textbook, and so there's a textbook group that they're doing live streams of. They're doing live streams of some of their decentralized governance stuff that they're doing, and they have other media in here that's really interesting. Again, it's all kind of managed as a live stream, so it's it's not pre-recorded videos. It's interesting how they can do that. It's just a very exciting kind of approach, but I don't think I'd want to do that for our lab because. But anyways, it's a really good YouTube channel to subscribe to. Of course, all the stuff from the symposium is there as well. Okay, so this is what I was talking about the purposefully non-standard cybernetics talk. So this was a message, I think it was from Daniel. It was just kind of back to me. And this was just kind of unsolicited. So it's nice. This was, I guess, after it played. And he says, purposefully non-standard cybernetics is great. I think it expands / reconsiders the cybernetic palette and retaxonomizes types of behavior in important ways. So that's interesting. I'm glad that they enjoyed that. I was putting that together, with some of what Jesse was doing, some of our conversations, some of what I'm interested in, kind of pulling it together, and that's what we ended up with. And I'm kind of glad that we were able to do that. So if you don't remember, we're kind of starting off at the Rosenbluth et al. 1942 or 43 paper on teleology, behavior, and purpose, moving out towards the view of what is teleology, having some historical information about these different themes, and then moving out towards different papers in the literature that kind of get at some of these issues of the behavioral taxonomy they proposed back in 1943. So, reorganizing it, thinking about it more critically, etc. So they really enjoyed that. That was good. And I think, the cybernetic palette is interesting because, this is, again, we have some approaches to cybernetics that, this stuff isn't static. I know these classic papers exist, but one of the reasons we're doing the cybernetics reading group is to expand what was being said there, to update it, to expand it, to see where it fits in to the modern world. And so I think we did that very effectively. That's good. This is the NeuroDesk talk. This is Stefan Bollman. Here he is up in the corner. I enjoyed this very much. He kind of went over a lot of interesting topics and, discussed sort of, their approach to open software, their sort of why they did it, why they spent the time to develop this containerization strategy. They did a lot of empirical tests to show that, containerization is superior to running things on your own computer and distributing software, and everyone using different software, hardware settings, and ending up with different results. And so I think it was a great sort of demonstration of that. And then we discussed how to create your own, kind of put your own software into containers, or there are ways that you can use what NeuroDesk has done, and instead of using it for neuroimaging, use it for something else, like an active inference piece of software. And then in the talk on open science and open source, I talked about some of the other Linux distros, like NeuroDebian, where they, allow you to put, have these builds, or it can put specific, maybe like active inference specific software, package it as part of the operating system. So it's just kind of, runs in that environment. So it was I think it was really well received. And, it's food for thought for Active Inference Institute because, like I said, there are a lot of packages that they use, and so it's we're is there an investment to be made there? This is the talk, an overview of open source and open science. This is something that Daniel also thought was very visionary and very good at a high level. And I encourage people to look through this talk. I know we talked a little bit about it in the planning sessions where we said, this is, like the series of issues that are important in building sort of a strategy for open source and open science. So, we have a lot of people talk about making things open source. Sometimes people just throw software up on the web. And none of that is really good for a number of reasons. Saying that everyone should, mandating that everyone should, be maximally open source or open science can, pave over a lot of the differences between organizations. Sometimes they have time to invest in building like infrastructure for, annotating data sets, preparing things for being open. So if I have a set of research tools or data that I want to put up, I can put it up and share it, but if people can't use it or understand what's going on, then it's not worth anything. So, having those strategies in place are good. And then it talks a little bit about infrastructure and some of the tools that we might use, some of the combinations of tools that might be sort of killer apps in the sense of making, enabling a lot more open source and open science or making it easier for people. And then talked a little bit about governance and that sort of thing. Also talked about some things like research engineering, or research software engineering, and some other areas where, where organizations need to invest to make some of these things happen. And so it was very interesting. I think Daniel was very impressed with sort of the breadth and depth of the talk. And this also advertises our open source interest group. So I actually talked a little bit about our open source sustainability models here, where I advertised some of that work being done. And so, and there was some work, of course, the stuff that Brian McCorkle did on active inference, but also the stuff that was done this summer on reinforcement learning and with large language models. So that is my overview of the active inference symposium. There's so much more there. I don't want to short shrift that stuff, but those are the highlights I found interesting.
Yeah. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a sore throat. But I thought the talks were great too, and I think the one that I don't think you mentioned Active Inference.jl.
Okay.
That particular team. I mean, the RxInfer was great, and it is interesting the reactive. I'm interested to know more about the reactive programming style.
Yeah.
They use I mean that's part of the Rx kind of that particular group's programming philosophy. And I think it's maybe a double play on reactive in the sense that reactive is both a programming style as well as they're talking about reactive systems,
Yeah.
But but I just wanted to mention Active Inference .jl because unlike the RxInfer team, which is kind of like a machine learning group, the I forget the lab's name. It's like IPAB or something like that. um, um, they're a like behavioral modeling group,
Okay.
you know.
Yeah.
So it somewhat relates to a paper I dropped in Cognition Futures on um, fitting cognitive, like, yeah, using cognitive architectures as part of your cognitive modeling, computational cognitive modeling.
Okay.
So kind of, ActR and SOAR as part of your kind of behavioral analysis. Um, and that seemed to be their particular yeah, like they were more cognitive people,
Yeah.
or behavioral, yeah, modeling people than RxInfer.
Yeah.
And even though they're both working in Julia, right?
Yeah.
Um, which is also interesting, but and I they they were the ones that were maybe a bit more uh, um, at least running up to discussing the point that kind of Ryan Smith um, and I think really emphasized. And I don't know if he, again, like, it was hard to tune in for all, all 12 hours is a big block like that.
Yeah.
But they got up to the point of kind of discussing where active inference kind of meets reinforcement learning, and how it because they were definitely talking about behavioral modeling, they were explicitly linking this to computational psychiatry, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Which again, you could just call, applied computational cognitive modeling or
Yeah.
something. And uh, yeah, so it's I don't know whether, I mean, they had talks from Carl, of course, and um, and I think maybe even a few previous recorded kind of tutorial things, um, but I didn't see, you know, didn't see the emphasis that Ryan puts on, how the active inference, directly relating matrices that, and the nomenclature that they use in the textbook to reinforcement learning standard terms.
Right.
Um, again, like I still want to see. I want to see. Well, I also dropped a link to. Sorry, let me see what the. I can't remember now. So there was a talk from Richard Sutton yesterday. Well, no, a couple days ago, but during the did I put that in Cognition Futures too? No, I think I put it in Frontier projects. Yeah, Open Mind Research. So anyway, but it was Richard Sutton, right? Who, was at a certain point was kind of like DeepMind Alberta was basically created to incorporate Richard Sutton's group into
Yeah.
DeepMind, right? And the focus was on right, just his um, kind of foundational work in reinforcement learning. I'd love to see um, Amy or Richard Sutton in particular kind of connecting um, the kind of Ryan Smith, tutorials into the kind of, just because Richardson is like, his textbook is like the reinforcement learning textbook, you know,
Yeah.
like I just wonder if he would have any additional thoughts on kind of where placing active inference in perhaps a kind of historical context, that making some connections that haven't previously been discussed or something like that.
Yeah.
And this open, what's he called again? Open Mind Institute. Sorry, my phone is yeah, Open Mind Research. So he I like this. So he gave a talk just a couple days ago. I think he called it dynamic reinforcement learning, and um, and I wasn't quite sure where he was going to go with that, but it seems to be, again, returning to this kind of continual learning, um, that that it's crazy to think about training tasks for one thing,
Yeah.
when obviously animals don't do that,
Yeah.
and or but yeah, and or it, and I think we can say at this point that cells don't do that. And um, uh, he I like this because he's brought up Amy before, but Amy seems to be just like his kind of post DeepMind institute. Um, that's AMII, right?
Yeah.
But this sounds like something that he's developed for people who've graduated. They've probably left academia, but still want to work on what he would call the Alberta plan, and thinking about, yeah, um, foundational topics in reinforcement learning.
Yeah.
And again, when he's talking about it, I think we're supposed to read kind of continual learning in that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think I think that would be a really, um, if I had one, um, so you can apply to be a fellow at the Open Mind Institute,
Yeah.
or Open Mind Research, right? um, and um, and uh, yeah, I think that would be a really interesting, um, start to something. Would be, just bringing some of those threads together, and and yeah, I just about the word cloud. I liked when Daniel was going over the word clouds. I forget who he was doing that with, but he was kind of having a discussion about the word clouds.
Okay.
And he was I think the other person was just like, huh, nobody's got LLMs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, good group, good group. Or I was just like, yeah, yeah, nobody's got LLMs, and that's okay.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, they yeah. Anyway, they come up enough, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
we're not in any LLM winner yet, right?
Yeah.
So uh but yeah, so it was nice to see that. And thought forge, um I definitely caught that talk. And um it was definitely, um interesting. I'm blanking on the connections there. I did drop a couple things in, I think, um, break, yeah, maybe breakthrough vehicles. Um, there's a DARPA thing that I thought was interesting. I think they call it Link, um, where the vehicle, it's something introspection, I think is the I in Link. And what this is you know, giving the robot the ability to assess its own damage and how to respond,
Yeah.
um, which I thought was an interesting, you know, um, like additional layer.
Yeah.
Um, and it certainly reminded me of things where, you know, um, Carl Pribram would say something like, you know, why is it like you've never been asked to like write with your foot before,
Yeah.
but if you are told like you've got to write a message with your foot and the pen, you know, you would probably be able to create something that is, you know, messy but perhaps legible, right?
Yeah.
And and not exactly the same thing, but sort of, right?
Yeah.
Like how to you know, this remarkable ability to adapt, which I guess is sort of also gets at the sort of gets at the Levin likes to quote William James, right? That intelligence is being able to solve the same problem in different ways or something like that. I
Yeah.
forget how he phrases it. Um, and yeah, so I couldn't think of anything in particular, but you know, I gotta say the robotics world just has a bunch of interesting talks. I forget which conference was. I don't know if people are pre-recording for NeuroPS or I know that there's other kind of robotic specific ones, but um, yeah, great symposium, and I did not catch Stefan's unfortunately.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. Well.
I did have things going on here, but glad you know, again, like I was kind of joking to someone that you know, kind of a tech person, um, that you know, if anything, I'm the old fuddy duddy who's, you know, cares about building packages for a particular distro, um, and you know, all the kids are just containerizing and using whatever works, and you know, one of the big controversies in Fedora currently is the rise of allowing flat hub packages,
Oh yeah.
um,
Yeah.
which is kind of the same thing, you know. Um, it's definitely kind of like a yeah. So it's suddenly the kind of the purity of the package in terms of, you know, how Fedora would want you to would want your package to never depend on internal libraries, always use the system libs and things like that, right? So it's like if I wanted to package something and it depended on three packages that didn't weren't already currently packaged in Fedora, like you know, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I'd be like, well, obviously I gotta create packages for those dependencies first, and then I can package the thing I actually want to package. And these days it's just like one, like, in addition to a package, the upstream group would probably give me a Docker option. Um, but I see a lot of people just making FlatHub packages out of these things. Anyway, it's nice to see, and it was nice, Yarrick did get back in touch at least,
I did see that. Yeah,
and
thank you.
yeah, and so I think again, like, you can see from Yarrick's, like, project list and his in his I don't know if you had a look at his PsyOps paper.
Actually, it did come
Uh,
up in the neuro AI workshop. So
oh, okay.
yeah, yeah,
Oh, okay. Oh, good. Um, uh, um, but he he could be a really great, kind of um, person to tap further, down the road on something like open source sustainability or things like that. Because this is someone who's yeah, really been doing it since he was a student, and he's a real he's a full on Debian contributor.
yeah,
Which Debian has its own rules for how you get that status. It's pretty good.
yeah. It's all good. Um, so yeah, thanks
Yeah,
Morgan for your feedback and insights on that.
yeah, no, it was great.
Yeah, this is
Yeah,
something we'll probably be revisiting for a while because there's so much content there and so many things to talk about and think about. Yeah, so like I said, I also did the Neuro AI workshop. I'm going to present on that next week. Did the Sci-Hub paper. It was interesting because that came up in the one of the sessions, and then you sent that in the Slack. So I was like, wow, is that the same? It's the same paper. So yeah, and I'll cover that next week. The Neuro AI workshop was a little bit different. It was at the NIH, but it was almost kind of a flavor of like DARPA in a way because it was like this topic that's out there. It's like you had neuroscientists, you had AI people, you had roboticists, and I was just kind of like they were kind of trying to figure out where they all fit together. But and then they had some good. I think they had some well phrased questions that they kind of raised, um, kind of in advance. So we'll come back to that next week. I got to prepare some things for that. Jesse, how are you?
Um, all right. It's been a busy week for me, but yeah, I've worked on a few different things. I don't know what you want to discuss next, but yeah.
I have a couple of articles, but we can discuss whatever you want. If you'd like to discuss the talk that you made for our YouTube
Oh
channel.
yeah. Um, it was okay. It was I wish I had a little bit more time to have it the way I wanted it to be. But it was a nice, I think it's sort of an overview of a lot of things, a lot of like very high level concepts that we've talked about. It was about, like management and I don't know, management and leadership for innovation and like research, doing really trying to think like it was a very wide ranging I use the term navigation, and I think I slipped in the start after the first slide, basically why navigation, because it's not, I don't want to do a talk about how to manage projects specifically. That's something I think, I mentioned your project management course, and there's a lot of things that they're doing details and workshops and everything else. Excuse me. That are, I think, more tailored for nuts and bolts, and I think even doing more detailed sort of writings ahead or discussions about that ahead or something that I'd like to do, as we've talked about before. But In general, the talk was essentially about navigating the different spaces. And I basically kind of frame things in sort of the mountains, monasteries, and metropolis um, sort of framework in attempts of it, it, when to kind of give a sense of what arena or what maybe more like not just arena because I talked specifically about industry and academia and nonprofit or actually startup spaces. I talk about those arenas specifically, but also I think there's sort of the mountains, monasteries, and metropolis sort of lens is useful in that when you're trying to bring about newness or new ideas or get people to do new things, so much of what is I don't know a term like effective leadership or good leadership is managing the affordances of the space that you're in and what kind of risks you can take. And I talk a little bit about, you know, different kinds of institutions and what kind of risks they can take. I talk a bit about um, the ways of collecting ideas as you're processing towards I mentioned twirly birds. I mentioned the idea of collecting ideas. I mentioned a lot of the different sort of higher level, almost sort of I guess the word is smorgasbord, but a lot of just concepts to keep in mind as you're going through, as you're sort of a leader in those spaces, and a little bit as to what it's like to be when you're not a leader too. Because I think part of it is not just the title of leader, but how do you work with the space that you're in, either as a more junior person who has less authority and direction, and as a person who's offering direction and offering space for people to do innovative things. So it was a very 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 broad, almost it was really more like an overview talk about that, and I think I'm all right with the talk. I think there's a few more details that could have slipped in there. It was long. It was 40 minutes, and that's okay because it felt quite um, dense, even though it was sort of high level, very high level. Everything was like very broad concepts, and I think what I'd like to do in the future is um, really expand upon them. Like many of the topics that are in there could be um, blog post type things, which I've set up a Substack for to make later. They could be like podcast episodes. They would be great discussions to really flesh out for people doing things in those spaces. Particularly, I would say, and I've tried to weave this in a little bit. I didn't do a tremendous. I didn't do too much of it. I kept it. I kept it as I didn't make it an advocacy piece, but I could, in the sense of um, I don't know. Um, I, one of the first things that I'm writing for the I don't know blog series on this topic specifically is about defining success in terms of what you're doing, and I think that's the one thing I didn't put in the main talk or really have time for or didn't want to get into in that setting was there's an implicit deep consideration for people. I think everybody doing like really trying to do like really innovative work, and this is you could put into it like data ethics or impact statements, like whatever There's different components to it, but in a more advocacy sense, I think there's a real sense of when you're holding space or making space or doing administrative efforts. Uh, what is it? Um, what is it that you are modeling or demonstrating or building people towards in terms of what success looks like? And is it success defined by what particular standards, what particular vision in the future, what particular, because success in one scope and success in another can look very different in terms of what it is that you're trying to both achieve, whether it's like financially or in terms of pure, what's considered scientific, pushing a scientific an idea forward in a scientific way, pushing a theory forward, doing something rigorous that lets other people test the merits of an idea or a concept or a theory or a principle. Like what is it that you're trying to do? And I think there's a discussion to be very, you know, open about that. In an ideal world, you can be very open about that with a lab, with your lab, with your group, with your organization, and say what you're trying to do. And I think it's not often an ideal world, but I think that's something that is important to talk about, particularly when we're in a state of people. I find a lot of people in um, a more fuller thought about this sort of defining success and advocacy piece that I didn't quite say is essentially when you're training people to build the future and look at things, what are you implicitly, how, as you're doing the theory work, how are you doing it in terms of both treating people but also like what end, and what's happening in terms of what you're creating and how is it affecting how things are developing. So that's the last sort of like 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes of my talking were things I didn't say in the talk, the things I'll kind of expound upon and then later writing about it, which is very much a little bit more, I think, in a philosophical advocacy, normative sense. Um, but the talk centered a lot around our ideas. To go back now, the talk centered a lot around ideas, basically things we talked about in the Friday meetings, in the Google Summer Code meetings, in terms of working in the different arenas, in terms of working with bureaucracy, in terms of being a mentor or a guide, someone trying to be a mentor or guide in various different arenas and situations and things to keep in mind. That's essentially what it was about. And I do think, I think the talk could be refined and spin off into a bunch of other things, but it was good to just make a sort of artifact to discuss more. So I hope to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. I haven't had a chance to look at it, but I'll take a look. I mean, I've looked a little bit at it, but I haven't really dove into it. I'll listen to it, like kind of give you some feedback. But I think that's great. That, at least getting an opportunity to get those ideas out into a coherent talk, and then you can take those parts of the talk and kind of explore those things. It's a lot like the other talks that we've done, where we're going to be going, and using those as sort of a way forward for certain things. Like, you can't get to the point of refining something if you can't define it, basically.
Yeah, and I feel like, I mean, this is much more of a. I've been thinking about this topic at large for a long time in the sense of like where does the topic fit? Like there's plenty of books on leadership and like kind of your business type books, how to be successful and leading a team to some end, that vision and management towards the vision. And like that's good and important in its own way. And there's like the far further end of sort of, I don't know, advocacy stuff, which is nice and important. And I do have things I want to say about that, obviously. But there's also this sort of, um, I think the middle ground and what I talked like what I really really broadly out was big, just a big high level outline on many terms is sort of, um, as you are either being guided or guiding other people doing really innovative stuff, what is that like? Because it's not really a kind, it's I think it's quite radically different than other kinds of, I don't even want to say work or employment, which is true, but um, just like ways of thinking, operating, like ways of measuring your success, ways of thinking like, oh, I spent my time well today.
Yeah.
I think it's different. Like I think it's very different space, and so I think a lot of people are in that space, and a lot of our references for it are essentially, okay, well, I put in 9 hours a day, or I went to the lab today, or I did my experiment today, and like, okay, like that's not, none of that's bad, but it's just I think there's a deeper conversation to be had about like not just doing research or science or whatever it is you want to call it, but being involved in the, well, I spent a little bit of time in the talk talking about community. Like I spent a few minutes on like demo or die and going beyond demo or die, which is something that we talked about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago specifically. But it's always been a theme here of like there's a reason for demo or die in terms of the very broad concept demo or deploy or die of like having something to show people, having something to say about what to show people. But the broader comes of beyond, going beyond demo or die is like that's really important to do, but also like how are you cultivating a lab environment where people can grow and share ideas and do this, like do the I don't really want to use the word softer stuff, but I think that's a conventional way of talking about it. Doing the sort of cultivating things. Like you're not gonna, difference between sort of having a careful incubator or a garden with seedlings that you're developing very carefully because they're not ready to withstand, the in a mountain metropolis monastery settings. The seedlings are not ready to survive in the metropolis yet. And Krakauer talks about his kind of God, his role as this guide between people developing their ideas in sort of this mountains, sort of more isolated, more remote development process, and then the monastery is sort of the training ground where you have in-house discussions that are cultivating but also challenging, and the metropolis is like okay out into the world, and it's similar, a similar lens of like beyond demo or die, and what we talked about there is sort of that cultivating this, creating a administratively creating a space for people to explore ideas and do work. And how do you do that? How do you do it knowing there's other things you're going to encounter? How do you do it knowing that like there's a certain amount of intentionality that it requires, um, and there's a certain amount of, I don't know, um, uh, it doesn't need to happen, but it could. So I don't know. There's many ways I could go. I could talk about this for a long time and like go into different components of it. But I do think it'll be interesting to flesh out a bit more, and I think it's something that it's something I'm learning how to host discussions about because I'm able to. I mean, we talk about it here, and it's coming up. I had a really nice conversation essentially this week with other people, one person in particular, sort of about like it's not just to deal with so many of the problems, the sort of intermediary problems that aren't just a matter of you know pushing a policy or research forward. It's also how do we you know um, enable and elevate and empower people along the way, uh, and it was nice because the person I was talking to was a completely different, very different field, but it was funny how similar the um, I guess challenges were because to deal with a lot of the deeper, there's sort of the the problem at hand, that the direct surface on the um, face value goal of doing the research, of doing improving the policy, improving the understanding of whatever phenomenon, whether it's and I was raising a bit of the complex world, so like whether it's not complex and then more like able to be reductionist and a lot of symmetry and a lot of more classical things, or whether you're dealing with complex stuff, whether you're dealing with like equilibrium or symmetry breaking things, like even in those spaces, sort of like you're still dealing with the world at large, and how do you like you know science doesn't happen in a vacuum, and neither does like the management and administration and development of people in those careers or vocations or those skills that's happen in the vacuum either. So that's largely what it was, um, about, and I look forward to developing um, a lot of those things in the next year, really.
Yeah, thanks for that. So yeah, it's interesting that mountains, monasteries, metropolis model. So that's something that Krakauer developed, and then they're kind of adapting that to demo or die, or something like demo or die. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of just I offered a bunch of frameworks. It wasn't all like it wasn't everything through that lens. It was just I've offered a bunch of different lenses, and I think it does fit. I think there's a way to think about it in terms of demo or die, but it's sort of a you know mountains and monasteries metropolis is more of a broader level.
Right.
Where are you in the idea generation process?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to kind of I don't know if Krakauer made it up or not, but he certainly used it, and he used it a lot in talking about like the SFI and what the institute's doing and their relative role is. I talked a little bit about this in the talk too, but like knowing what kind of risks is your organization taking? What is it? Is it monetary? Is it idea? Is it what degree of each can they do and why? And like it's sort of relative to understanding what you can do in the situation and what do you want to do. What kind of risks are you open to taking at the time that you're in, as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. And then, this idea of demo or die, it's interesting because in my project management class, I talk about the origins of demo or die. So basically, it comes out of the MIT Media Lab. The idea is to do this sort of practice where you put something into practice from an idea, you build a prototype or you show how something works, and then to have that experiential learning where people can see the details, they can see how it works. It doesn't have to be something that's finished, it can be just something that's like a prototype. And then you keep doing this over and over. So the idea is that the demo becomes like this thing that you can kind of work from. So you do a demo, you get feedback, you do another demo, you get feedback, and then you kind of polish everything out. I do talk in my graduate class now about how sometimes you can create a demo just for the sake of creating a demo. Like a lot of academic labs will do this where they'll have like 2 or 3 demos. Sometimes you'll see it a lot in like virtual reality or extended reality where, they'll like some company will build a demo and they'll say, this is a demo of how something works. And they'll really get it polished. And it's like this experiential thing. And then, the demo though, at that point just becomes like its own artifact. It doesn't lead to any kind of progress. It's just kind of like, I'm operating this thing under perfect conditions, and then it's sort of fragile to any sort of further development because you've worked it out so well just in that one area that might actually not be a very good, say, piece of software, but it works well just for the thing you're demoing. And so what value is that? Is that a experiential learning value? Is that like developing the ideas value? What is that? And so, kind of going over the different ways that you can do demo or die. There's also deploy or die, which is a little bit different, where you have to actually deploy something because the problem with demos, of course, is that they can be, self-contained, and they don't really give you, they don't really give you any sort of, they just show like this thing you want to show people. It's almost like a magic trick. So yeah, we should talk about that more. I think definitely And I think your kind of approach of kind of connecting like innovation with demo or die is really important, because that's why we do demos basically. We're doing it as part of a process to develop things. I mean, we can do the demos for demo's sake, but like, that's not necessarily as valuable. So that's good. So why don't we move on here? And I think we had a good discussion about all this stuff, and this is like where I think we should revisit some of this. I think the purposefully non-standard cybernetics, we need to kind of rethink, like maybe how to get things out of that, and maybe create some papers out of it, or follow up on some things that were mentioned in there but weren't like really developed highly. But that's what we do here. That's why we're doing this. So I'm going to go over this article here. This is Peter Holme's blog, and of course he does a lot of good work with in terms of complexity theory and networks and all this. And this article is it's older. Well, it's not older. It's fairly new. It's from October of 24. I was maybe think of another article, but so this is a fairly new article, October of 24, Surviving the Complexity Winter. I think that's a compelling title given some of the discussions we've had about AI summers and AI winters and that historical fluctuation. So he's saying that, I guess, currently complexity and complexity theory is in a winter. And so I don't know, how he wants to define that, but let's find out. So the top says complexity science in 2024, claiming to be what it's never been, but gladly giving away its Nobel Prize. So the background here is that there was a Nobel Prize, I think last year, in physics that was related to some of the foundational concepts of complexity. And since it's a physics award, but it's sort of for complexity. It wasn't for complexity specifically, but that's the way that at least people were talking about it. So this is interesting. It sort of stresses how complexity science is sort of at the nexus of all these different areas. And so some of it is like, that when you get down to like the traditional disciplinary divides in science and in academia, complexity science doesn't fit neatly into any of them. So there might be some supporting materials, the people supporting ideas people develop. And in the world of evaluation, people say, well, that's physics. Or, it could be that, you develop a network technique for social networks, and people say, well, that's sociology. But it's just as useful in maybe like biological networks or physics as it is in sociology, and just having that flow, the interchange between fields. One of the problems with this, of course, is that a lot of these things lose their coherent identity as a field. So complexity science, loses its identity as a field when you have people in different fields kind of, doing their thing. So that's what he's talking about here. And so this article is a reflection on where the science of complex systems stands today and where it should and could go next. So he says, I'm as excited as everyone else that Hopfield and Hinton got the Nobel Prize in Physics. So this is from about this year's award. And again, this year's award was about machine learning, neural networks. But you think about the topics that are covered in Hopfield and Hinton's work, it's like physics, cognitive science, computer science, and it's a physics award. So that's kind of, again, subsuming some of those identities to physics, reducing it to physics. The biological foundation of computation has been part of many of the holistic tribes. And he uses the word holistic tribes, and that is defined as the disconnected scientific movements of the 20th century, centered around systems, explaining systems by zooming out rather than zooming in. So this is this term holistic tribes. He has a blog post on that from February of 24. And what that means is just like these groups that want to see things at the, sort of the non-reductionist scale. thinking about how things are at the aggregate instead of in terms of the reduction. So this is, kind of saying that it doesn't really form a coherent field because it's just people adopting techniques. They could be in neuroscience, they could be in sociology, they could be in physics, and there may be like a complexity science, but in terms of the questions that people are asking, there isn't really any coherence. It's mostly in the methods. So this is a problem in science. If you're asking questions, that's kind of always seen as like the core. Although sometimes in like computer science, the methods are pretty important. But usually the way that people define coherent fields is in the questions they're asking. So that's kind of what he's getting at here. It would be entirely in order to uncork another bottle of Krug and party like it's 2021 all over again. This was the Nobel Prize where, this was awarded sort of for complex systems. It was a physics Nobel, and that was in 2021, so my mistake. But that is a discussion of that. But oh no, my complexity colleagues unanimously called this a prize to AI and join in the discussion of whether AI is physics or not. So this is where, again, is the Hopefield and Hinton Nobel Prize, is this like a prize to AI? Or is it a prize to physics? Or is it even a prize to complexity? I mean, it's just really depends on your perspective. And he's talking about complexity theorists calling the Hopefield and Hinton Prize a prize to AI instead of appreciating that it's a prize to a number of fields, not just physics. The Nobel part of the story doesn't end there, because the Nobel Foundation was kind enough to give AI another round of awards, this time in chemistry. So this is again the AlphaFold Award that was given. We talked about that in the previous meeting. And again, this is another example of how it's a chemistry award, but there are all sorts of things involved in AlphaFold: computer science, physics, complexity theory, even, and also chemistry. So you have to give it in some area. And the point is that it isn't just that area. There are a bunch of things that are being sort of brought to the fore, but people conceive of these things as different, depending on who's looking at it and giving the take on it. The striking thing is that the chemistry prize, at least Hesibus and Jumpers, is a brilliant example of AI as not complexity science. All prediction, all black box, very cool and well deserved, but not complexity science per se. So it has this aspect of complexity, but it's not complexity science as we define it currently. And complexity science then being driven by methods, because you're talking about prediction versus other things, black box versus defining the parts or defining the phenomena. So there are differences in the way it's approached. AI and complexity science overlap, but one does not contain the other. That's the important point. So, like, some of people were uninitiated in the methods of complexity science, and maybe some of that is because complexity science is really kind of a catch bag of questions and methods, mostly methods, that are maybe similar to what you're trying to do in AI, but they're different, different fields, different things that you're trying to do. So it's interesting there. I also caught the AI bug, and many of my ongoing projects try to find nifty uses of large language models to ultimately learn about people. I also have some admittedly less interesting. Let's explore the capabilities of AI by letting them do something that we know how humans do research. So that's a long statement. Let's explore the capabilities of AI by letting them do something that we know how humans do research. So this is like kind of basically, we know what humans do in terms of behavior. We get AI to replicate that behavior, and then we look at the capabilities of the AI to see what those involve. But we don't actually make a strong comparison with sort of the neural and cognitive capabilities of humans when they do the same thing. So, and then of course, even that is an abstraction of what we think is going on. Like, we could use like, task learning in like psychological experiments versus a sort of naturalistic or continual learning that people usually engage in. And the same holds true for the AI, that we compare it at sort of this artificial level of capabilities and behaviors. So that's interesting. I would never dream of calling that complexity science, but leafing through the abstracts of recent complex systems conferences, I see many such studies. Cool science, but hardly complexity science. So what he's saying is that basically complexity science is being sort of, people are kind of moving in the direction of kind of almost making it into AI research. So like, if you're using methods, you can use AI methods and apply them sort of nominally to sort of what we might call complexity science. But a lot of times it just kind of veers into just AI. And so it's kind of keeping complexity science, away from its true potential. Another sign of the times is that many of the core ideas of complexity science in the 1990s have been absorbed back into the traditional academic disciplines. So this is like, network theory or some of the statistical analyses. Used to be that like these were new ideas. Oh, I can analyze something using a network. Or, oh, I can analyze like a power law on something. Or I can look at like dynamical systems. Isn't that interesting? And it's a different thing from what's happening in a field. So like in neuroscience, at the time there was no real great, there was some discussion of it, but no great pillar of neuroscience was, dynamical systems theory. And so people kind of developed that on their own, and it was considered complexity science or an instance of complexity science. Now, as it's become more accepted, it's kind of going back in the direction of neuroscience, and people think of that work, well, that's neuroscience, not complexity theory. So it's sort of a, kind of a classification problem, but also like, who are you interacting with? Back then, if you wanted to use dynamical systems approaches, you'd have to kind of go to a physics department or go to a dynamical, systems group or go to a complexity group, and you wouldn't talk to neuroscientists so much. But then now, as it's become more common, it can all be subsumed in neuroscience. You can have conversations with other dynamical neuroscientists, and it's part of that field. I recently chatted with a management scholar who pointed out how ideas from complexity science, that is, systems performing optimally at the edge of chaos, have been integrated, textbookized, and gentrified to the point nobody sees a need to look to complexity science for new ideas. So it's basically these ideas have been incorporated, but also in ways that are sort of maybe not as pure as we had them in the 90s in complexity science. So they've been kind of modified for their home field. And maybe sometimes to their detriment, but it's not something that people are looking to complexity science for. They have the tools in-house in their own discipline. So why go outside the discipline to look for them? And of course, that's a problem because complexity science can be very fertile for a whole host of new approaches, but people are not necessarily looking always to complexity science for that cutting edge. Further evidence of how systems-related topics have partly fallen out of fashion and partly merged with other fields of knowledge is their fading presence in the public political discourse. So if we want to find out about this, we go back to sort of the mid-century, mid-20th century, where we had, cybernetics, and we had cybernetics applied to public policy, and we had like Herbert Simon and his sort of technocratic ideas applied to public policy. And then, we had systems ecology, we had things like limits to growth, where we had system science and government system science and policy, and people were thinking about things in terms of systems. So there was this whole like fad of like systemy type things, like the Institute for Future Studies, and these other institutions and topics that kind of fell by the wayside, partially as people started thinking about systems in their own fields, and partially because maybe some of the shortcomings of systems approaches And partially because it was kind of, faddish in the sense that people always look for fads, look for new types of approaches, and then when they don't deliver, everything they had hoped, they kind of abandon them and move on. And which is unfortunate because, of course, we know about the hype cycles and how everything can reach a peak, and then there are these deflated expectations, and then there's this plateau of productivity. So we're kind of at the plateau of productivity for the systems approaches, and so that's kind of the problem. That I think complexity science has paid the price for that. This is not the end, however. Just like the famous AI winters of the past, this complexity winter will give way to another spring. The reason I'm fairly sure of this is that the desire to understand a fundamental human trait, which is nothing seems to be more prominent about human life than its wanting to understand all and put everything together. And this is attributed to Buckminster Fuller, who articulated it in the book Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. Ultimately, we can't do that without the most fundamental and radical of complexity science ideas. So this is basically the idea. And this is from A Better Way of Thinking About Emergence, which we talked about in a previous meeting, but this is the sort of the idea. That causality is not the atom of scientific explanation, but rather we need explanation in the form of models, systems diagrams, systems thinking, etc., feedback loops included. So we need to kind of not think just about causality in the conventional sense. We can't think about A causes B causes C. We need to think in terms of more sophisticated models and feedback loops and retrocausality and loopiness, like loopy Bayesian approaches, or there are a whole bunch. I actually, in purposely non-standard cybernetics, we kind of get into some of that like retrocausality that results from having a feedback loop. So you have the present, then you have the past, and then you have the future. So I can diagram that out just really quick because we do talk about it in the talk. I want to maybe go over that a little bit. Okay, so let me go over this a little bit. So basically the idea is that you have conventional causality, which would be A to B to C. And, this is like causes, So, we have to do some more formal tests for causality. We have to do like interventions and things like that to test and doing counterfactuals and things like that. But basically, that's the idea. A causes B causes C. Now, in a feedback loop, you don't have that necessarily. You might have A to B to, B prime, and then down to C. And then this kind of goes like this. So in this case, you have something like the present, A to B, there's a transfer, in the present from A to B. Then you have a feedback, which is the past, so it's self-referential or referential. So B prime is the past. And then that gets combined here with a feed-forward present, just as we have from A to B, but now you're adding in the past, which then gives you both the present and the past, but now it's as an output, it's the future, because you've done something to the present to modify it. So this is something we're developing in the talk, where you have these kind of past, present, future relations, and it's not really a word salad because you can actually do some really interesting things here, where you have like B prime, and then you have another feedback which is like B prime prime, and then you can go up here and have like your information coming from maybe another source, which might be C and D, and then that gives us an alternate future E, and then we might have another future out here, like F, where we have this motif from here. We end up with these alternate futures. And the reason they're alternate futures is because they involve different levels of self-reference and different levels of referencing the past. So here we have the present, here we have the past, here we have a deeper past, and then we have another alternate present, and then we have now a future and a future. So you can see that that's how that would work. So you can have these different types of, even with like basic causality and putting it into like a system like a cybernetics system, you can get all sorts of complex behaviors that you wouldn't otherwise have. And then, of course, there are other things like in systems diagrams, you have loops, you have feedbacks, you have, a lot of contributions to a certain thing. So even if we do understand that, basically A causes B, you have other inputs that don't allow you to make a definitive statement about what causes what. So again, if we have, something like, go up here. So if we have something like A causes B, we might have another A prime, also causing B, or A prime prime causing B. So each of these are kind of an alternate form of A, and they're all acting on B. So then we have to decide, okay, if A is the main causal factor, then what is the role of these other factors? So this might be secondary causal, this might be tertiary causal. So it's not as easy now to say that A causes B because there are these other things pulling on it. And that leads you to C, which indeed might have other things that kind of play on C, like B prime and B prime prime. And this is, of course, where you can use things like interventions to, determine which causal factor is the strongest. But, it's like when you do something like a PCA, you have, components that contribute a certain amount of the variation to the problem you're looking at. So even then, when you have these causal chains, you can have multiple inputs that kind of tamp down the predictability of the system. So that's kind of my thinking on that. So this is all stuff that we never really resolved in the earlier sort of saturation of systems thinking. We kind of dealt with a lot of systems diagrams and building models of feedback and models of sort of holistic representations. But there are a lot of questions that were never answered that we can kind of come back to and kind of figure out and get more deeply into. And I think actually the Markov blankets idea is interesting because in traditional systems approaches, the boundary of the system is very important, but it was very hard to define. And so now Markov blankets kind of serve that purpose. But again, we need more innovation in thinking about some of these old systems approaches, just as we need innovation in thinking about classic cybernetics stuff. So for a moment, we might be infatuated by causal inference and black box prediction, which is sort of the currency of machine learning, and having like these black boxes that generate stuff, and not really understanding the mechanisms, or the systems underlying them, but just understanding the output. So we can do that all day, but that crush will not last forever. And for the record, I'm not a prediction is not understanding memer, almost the opposite, which I should at least write a blog post about. So yeah, some people say that prediction is not understanding, which is true, but I think, sometimes it is, but it's not deep understanding. So, I leave that to you, especially Jesse likes to think about things like this. To end on a high note, I just finished teaching complex systems for the first time in 10 years, and I can tell many students really like the material. Instead of following the prototypical syllabus, essentially a storyline and an accompanying skill set that were ready in place in Herman Haken's 1981 Synergetics. So we've kind of covered the sort of the history of, I did a presentation in Cognition Futures a long time ago on sort of complexity science in ecological psychology. And we talked about J.S. Kelso's work on synergetics in motor control. And one of the things that he did was he went to visit Hermann Haken back in the 80s, and they had a long collaboration. So Hermann Haken's ideas were physics, and they explained a lot of things in physics. And then J.S. Kelso took those ideas and ported them to perceptual science, to ecological psychology. And so now those ideas are sort of part of the dynamical systems view of neuroscience, but they started out in physics. So, we have these kind of tools that kind of follow different trajectories throughout intellectual history, but they're kind of, they're all part of complexity theory. And then so you can have a class where you kind of go through that history. But in this case, Petter focused only on the zoo of ideas and frameworks and their different takes on the pillars of complexity science, holism, emergence, etc. So, yeah, there are all sorts of frameworks out there. Maybe that's part of the problem. So that there's so many competing frameworks. There's synergetics, there's, dynamical systems, there's control theory, there are a lot of different approaches that one can take, and they're all different. They're all basically trying to do the same things, more or less, but they all have different toolboxes where they might have slightly different tools. And, that's one of the problems, maybe, is that it's like a lot of these complexity approaches have devolved into fiefdoms where it's about tool building and about methodological, uh, you know, particularities rather than keeping to the main ideas, the main questions, and not asking questions in specific fields, but asking more fundamental questions about the world. So it's interesting that that's a good way to think about this. Those ideas will never die, or at least never not be reborn. And so this is another link to the Holistic Tribes article. The complexity science we have today could maybe die, though, by presenting itself as something popular that isn't, and then being swallowed by that two-lettered something, which is, I guess, AI or ML or whatever. Okay, any questions on that? I know Jesse mentioned this in our admin meeting last week, and he asked about the submissions and aspirations document that we had been working on a long time ago. And I actually got it out of I found it on the Google Drive for the lab, and it's interesting. I don't know if we want to start using it again. Let me go back to it. Actually, let me go to some of these. Okay, we don't have anything there. Okay, so let me share my screen and I'll go back to this. So this is the old submissions and aspirations document. We had 2021. We had a lot of stuff going on there, a lot of virtual conferences and things. And as those dwindled, we kind of did a lot of stuff in 22. Then 23 it kind of dwindled, and then 24 we never actually provided a stub for that. So we have 21, 22, 23, then a programs and training document that I don't know if Jesse's still aware of. But this is like kind of talking about different doctoral programs. I think this is a good resource for interns and students. Maybe it comes out of here and goes into its own document. And then this is a associated pivot table. So this is really, I think, based on Jesse's explorations, but people can use this if they want. But my question is, we should maybe create a 2024 version of this and review it. We've gotten away from it for a while, obviously, but I don't know if that's something that's of use. Like I said, probably start with 2025 since 2024 is almost over. But I just wanted to revisit that to make sure that we knew about it and were aware of it.
Sorry, I didn't hear if there's a question at the end.
Oh, well, I mean, I was showing what we have in terms of that document. Is that something that might still be useful, or should we rethink that
Oh
document?
yeah, I mean, I think we should think about it's the end of the year. Like we should think about what we're trying to target for next year for sure.
All right.
I haven't prepared anything else yet, but I think looking at opportunity the version of it that I'd like to see is sort of, yes, events, things to submit to, like the actual calls, and then perhaps it could all be in one sheet or one database. Notion would be very good for this. I haven't. I could put something there. I have my own. I've shifted my own stuff away into other spaces, so it's a little bit. Um, I'm not in that space, like in that database as much as I could be, I suppose. But it's sort of like, I don't know, like um, it's a little bit of chicken or the egg or cart before the horse about it. Like I'm happy to do it. I don't know if anybody really is going to care about it beyond me, but like I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to look like have a section about grants and funding and opportunities, which I've been applying to a bit more lately and stuff like that. So I mean, I don't really know what other people would find value in, but I will be doing things in those spaces for sure.
I think that set of resources you have on graduate stuff is good, and but I think maybe it comes into a different set of like different place to store it, so we can access it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like the list of programs. I'm sure is I don't even know if that's really up to date anymore. So I haven't touched that in several years. So
People have done this with like NeuroRumbler and things where they have like up to date information and it's crowdsourced and it's still out of date. So, but it's I don't know. I don't know if it's worth the time to invest in it. That's what I'm saying. But still, it's something for students if they want to get a sense of what's out there. And then I don't know what our opportunities are for 2025. We need to kind of go over those too, like kind of make a list of things. But I don't want to do that right now. I want to do that offline, so we can move on. But just as a reminder. Okay. Anything else, Jesse, before we move on? Or
no, I'm gonna have to leave in a little bit also.
okay.
But sometime I I think I don't know if in Slack would be best for this or somewhere else, but like actual um I think having some administrative discussion about like actual targets. I think it'd be good to talk a bit more about next year soon, because I've had the opportunities to put out some internships things again. I have to follow up. I have to follow up with things with Albany and San Diego and some other um, things here in Boston too. So I'd like to, and maybe that's just something for me to spearhead. I don't know if there's any other thoughts about it, but like maybe a Friday
Yeah.
would be a good Friday meeting for something like that.
Yeah.
Talking basically about next year and like doing the administrative. If my talk earlier was this more lofty discussion about organizing and setting things up and navigating through spaces, this is the nuts and bolts, gritty, and just dates and numbers and charting a course for the road to be paved, which is maybe less fun, but it equally is important. So I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, this is where we throw all the high-minded theory out the window and just kind of go with the practice.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Thank you. So let me get ready for this next segment. Let's see. I'll do this one. So, yeah, so I think there's like, some interesting stuff in the complexity science article and in a lot of the active stuff that was discussed this week. It's very limited. Well, it's not very limited, but it's very much part of that, sort of in the service of active inference, especially applications of active inference. What we're going to do now is talk about some neuroscience related things. And this is a set of things that are these projections, innervations, and actions. So we're talking about like action or active stuff in the brain or in the mind. And we're talking about some of the neuroanatomy and some of the systems that contribute to that. So let me start here, I think. So this is, this is going to be a collection of things that are kind of all over the place, but you'll see the connections as we go along. So this is an article from Regenerative Medicine. It's a Nature journal, and it's a review article called Innervation, the Missing Link for Biofabricated Tissues and Organs. So this is where, we talk about if we create tissues and organs, say in an organoid or something like that, or we create an artificial organ on its own, we can create this thing in a lab, in a culture environment. But how do we integrate it with the body? Because that's ultimately the goal for a lot of this stuff. Sometimes it's for like studying medical research, but sometimes it's for actually putting them in the body. So, and of course, we have to think about development. So, in development, we have cells that differentiate, they form tissues, they form connections with other parts of the body, critically, and then they operate. So, the organizational scheme is very different than if you took something, grew it in a culture, and then put it into the body. You have to have those connections there. And that's one of the barriers, actually, of a lot of bioengineering is that, integrating things into the surrounding tissue, integrating things into the connectivity of the body, connectivity of the nervous system sometimes is always a problem. And so people have tried various strategies to do this. So what they're arguing is that for biofabricated tissues and organs, we need innervation. And innervation is basically where the nervous system innervates nerves into the organs. So like if you have something like like when we talked about the vagal nervous system, there are all sorts of innervation going on there. Nerves innervating different tissues like the gut and the digestive system and other places. And those nerves actually serve a critical role in sensing things inside the body and getting information to the brain for a whole host of autonomic functions. So that's why it's important. And yet at the same time, you can't really have, like, you can't put in a stomach without having it innervated properly. And so that's a problem for these kind of explants or implants. Okay, so the abstract reads, innervation plays a pivotal role as a driver of tissue and organ development, as well as a means for their functional control and modulation. So again, we need to have innervation of the nervous system to modulate these kind of autonomic behaviors that we expect. Therefore, innervation must be carefully considered throughout the process of biofabrication of engineered tissues and organs. Unfortunately, innervation has generally been overlooked in most non-neuronal tissue engineering applications. So unless we're talking about something specific like the spinal cord, like if we want to reconnect the spinal cord where there might be an injury, you can usually build a little, splint where you have growth factors that allow for axonogenesis. And we understand maybe kind of how to do that, but that's really the extent of how we've done this. And so, in part due to the intrinsic complexity of building organs containing heterogeneous native cell types and structures. So a lot of times we'll build organs and they'll be very much like the main cell types. And there may be other cell types that occur, maybe partially as a result of innervation, sometimes as a consequence of innervation. And so this is something we don't have as well. To achieve proper innervation of engineered tissues and organs, specific host axon populations typically need to be precisely driven to appropriate locations within the construct, often over long distances. So you need to facilitate this axonogenesis, but the ways in which you do it are going to depend you have to design specifically for that. As such, neural tissue engineering and/or axon guidance strategies should be a necessary adjunct to most organogenesis endeavors across multiple tissue and organ systems. To address this challenge, our team is actively building axon-based living scaffolds that may physically wire in during organ development. So this is, kind of what they're doing, say, in the spinal cord. They have some scaffold where they have growth factors. They have the conditions for that, encourage axonogenesis, and maybe some guidance cues, so that they don't connect to the wrong places. So this is a really complex problem because we don't. First of all, we really have maybe a tenuous understanding of how these wiring, how this wiring works and what constitutes the right connections. But also just kind of building these scaffolds where you leave it up to the axons to do their thing. It's just kind of a hard thing to really kind of get to work. So we're able to do this maybe to physically wire axonal connections in organ development and bioreactors, and/or serve as a substrate to effectively drive targeted long-distance growth and integration of host axons after implantation. So you could do it both in culture and after implantation. This article reviews the neuroanatomy and the role of innervation in the functional regulation of cardiac, skeletal, and smooth muscle tissue, and highlights potential strategies to promote innervation of biofabricated engineered muscles, as well as the use of living scaffolds in this endeavor for both in vitro and in vivo applications. We assert that innervation should be included as a necessary component for tissue and organ biofabrication, and that strategies to orchestrate host-axonal integration are advantageous to ensure proper function, tolerance, assimilation, and bioregulation within the recipient post-implant. So this is a paper from 2020. So this is just a review of kind of the work that's been done. This is an example kind of what they're talking about. You have an organ on the left, cardiac muscle, different types of smooth muscle, skeletal muscle. And then, so they're just working with muscle. And then they talk about the development and how those projections occur on the development. So in cardiac muscle, you have timing of innervation, which regulates adult heart size. So the actual size of the heart is regulated by nervous system innervation. In smooth muscle, you get innervation of bladder walls. It starts early during organogenesis, and in gastrointestinal tracts, common signaling pathways regulating enteric nervous system and gut development. So a lot of things are regulated by these connections. And in skeletal muscles, we have neurotrophins that are needed for development. We also get synapse elimination. So even when you're talking about any type of muscle, different types of muscle, we have these different types of connectivity that are essential for development, but we have to recognize, exactly what they are. Then we have functional regulation. So there are all sorts of regulation. In cardiac muscle, these innervations regulate or modulate heart rate and contraction force. In smooth muscle, we get regulation of transit, muscle contraction, absorption, secretion, and immune function. And then in alpha motor neurons, they regulate the opening of things like the sphincter or sphincters in the gut system, and then bladder wall contraction and relaxation. And then, of course, in skeletal muscle, we have muscle contraction and neuromuscular junction. So a lot of functional aspects of interplay with the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And in terms of tissue engineering, then we can see how we can build these different scaffolds. We have injectable hydrogels, different types of scaffolds, perfusion and mechanical stimulation. We have intestinal organoids. We have reconstruction of the bladder wall, where we can use cellular scaffolds. And then we have, in skeletal muscle, we have injection of motor neurons and surgical embedding with nerves. So there are all sorts of techniques that we can use as well. So this is a diagram of sort of what we have. We have the central nervous system here, and we have the peripheral nervous system out here. we have different organs like the heart, the gastrointestinal tract, the bladder and skeletal muscle. We have the sympathetic chains along the side, which kind of go along the spinal cord, and there's communication between the sympathetic chain and the organs. So the sympathetic nervous system is, communicating with this peripheral aspect of the nervous system, going up to the central nervous system and getting processed. There's local processing in the peripheral nervous system as well. But this all depends on how these organs are innervated and the connections that are made between organs and the nervous system itself. So you can see that the legend down here, there are different types of connections: preganglionic and postganglionic sympathetic, preganglionic and postganglionic parasympathetic, and somatic motor neurons. So that's the system. And, this is just kind of going over some of the approaches that have been used and some of the trends in the future. So the second paper is the laminar pattern of proprioceptive activation in human primary motor cortex. And this is kind of talking about now proprioception and how this is activated in this laminar pattern in primary motor cortex. So this is a bioRxiv preprint from last year, but I don't know if it's been published yet. But anyways, the abstract reads, the primary motor cortex, or M1, has traditionally been viewed as a motor output generator. However, its vital role in proprioceptive somatosensation, which means you're taking in signals from the body, from the periphery, from the hands, the feet, the skin of different types, and then even internal systems. To some extent, we have this proprioception where we have this map of the body and how the nerves innervate the surface of the body and other things. So we have like maps. If you've ever seen the homunculus, where you have like, a very large face with big lips. It looks like a human, but it's like scaled to the number of connections that exist, the density of connections that exist in different tissues. So you have like huge lips, a huge face, and then a large head, large hands, large feet, and then the rest of the body is very small, and the genitalia are expanded as well. And that's just a map of like, how dense innervation is in those different areas, those different tissues. And then that's all represented in the M1 area in terms of a somatosensory map. So you get this kind of input, and it's processed, and you get this interaction with motor cortex. So yet our understanding of proprioceptive somatosensation in M1 at the laminar scale is limited, largely due to methodological challenges. Empirical findings in primates and rodents suggest a pronounced role of superficial cortical layers. So this is studies in both primates and rodents. So this is a mammalian brain. So we have these superficial cortical layers, but the involvement of deep layers is yet to be examined in humans. So the superficial cortical layers are the ones on the top, the deep layers are the ones on the bottom. So this is different layers of processing in cortex, where you have the 6 layers, and you have these relays that go down layer by layer, and the different layers do different types of processing. So you're really kind of familiar with sort of the superficial cortical layers and how those contribute to these somatosensory maps and how to integrate proprioception, but the deep layers are not as well understood. So they're using sub-millimeter resolution fMRI for this study, or at least they're talking about the method, paving the way for the study of layer-dependent activity in humans, or what they call laminar fMRI. So fMRI is sort of hampered by its resolution, among other things, but the resolution doesn't necessarily allow you to, because you get these voxels that are, a couple millimeters cubed. And so that doesn't allow you, that allows you to look at different brain regions, but not the layers of cortex. So you need sub-millimeter resolution fMRI for that, to look at the layer by layer interactions there. So this is what they're talking about when they talk about laminar fMRI. In the present study, laminar fMRI was employed to investigate the laminar pattern of proprioceptive somatosensation on M1 deep layer activation using passive finger movements as proprioceptive stimulation. So this is where you have this finger movement paradigm looking at somatosensation, looking at how it's integrated in M1, and then looking at these deep layers. Significant M1 deep layer activation was observed in response to proprioceptive stimulation across 10 healthy subjects using vascular space occupancy, or VASO, at 7 Tesla. For further validation, 2 additional subjects were scanned using a balanced steady-state free precession sequence with ultra-high and plane resolution. So these are all neuroimaging technical points. The point is here is that they did, some validation steps. They used a high-resolution scanner, and they were able to observe this over 10 healthy subjects, which in fMRI is, a decent sample size. These results were interpreted in the light of previous laminar fMRI studies and the active inference account of motor control. So they're bringing in active inference here. We suggest that a considerable proportion of M1 deep layer activation is due to proprioceptive influence, and that deep layers of M1 constitute a key component in proprioceptive circuits. So this is important. So we get this innervation of the body of the skin and the organs, the parts of the body that are exposed to the world. There are different degrees of innervation there that leads to this density map. It's in the upper layers of M1. Then those innervations are further processed in terms of it's consistent with active inference, or the deep layers of M1. Okay, let's go down to the discussion. So they talk about their study. They talk about passive movements activating both superficial and deep layers of M1. That's good. And then, to our knowledge, M1 activation in response to proprioceptive stimulation has not been studied at the human laminar level previously, but consistent with our findings, numerous studies have established strong M1 involvement in relation to proprioceptive perception. So, for example, proprioceptive sensations can be induced by tendon vibration, which elicits an illusion that the corresponding limb is moving. So you can actually vibrate tendons, and the limb which those tendons are on, there's this illusion. There's these proprioceptive illusions that you can elicit by doing things like tendon vibration. And so this means that there's it's basically activating those innervations along the tendon, and it's showing up in the brain. M1 has been shown to be the most strongly activated area during such illusions, despite the fact that subjects did not actually move the limb nor intend to do so. So this is an interesting point, because there's a lot of literature on motor planning and motor preparation, and you can measure ERPs that kind of precede movement of limbs. What's interesting here is that you can actually have activations that are decoupled from movement, but also intention of movement. And that's interesting, because, that's something that we have a number of motor illusions. We think about visual illusions all the time, but there are a number of motor illusions that actually speak to this sort of, what's going on when we move our bodies. Is it intentional? Are there unintentional components? Is there like this, map that is immutable? Can we, introduce illusions at different levels of the nervous system? We can do all these kind of interesting things. Activation was only found when the tendon was vibrated at frequencies that did not elicit the illusion, thereby excluding tactile influence. So you can actually exclude tactile inference. So they get down to this last statement, and they say, thus deep output layers may be actively involved in shaping proprioceptive sensations, as opposed to merely using it to guide output. So this is where these deep output layers actually shape a lot of these proprioceptive sensations from the innervation of the tissue, and instead of just guiding output. So it's interesting. In view of the increasing prominence of hierarchical Bayesian theories of brain function and their inherent link to laminar circuitry, we propose an alternative interpretation of the observed deep layer signal. This is based on the active inference framework, which is Friston, which is particularly relevant to the sensory motor system. According to the canonical microcircuit underlying active inference, proprioceptive stimulation should strongly activate superficial layers of M1, which are the ones on the top, since neuronal units at this depth are the targets of driving feed-forward proprioceptive prediction errors. So when you have this sort of, you're matching actual proprioception with the model that should be there, you get these prediction errors. And so you're getting some sort of error correction eventually. So that's where you're creating these errors or driving these feed-forward errors. So these feed-forward errors continuously update expectations about the current proprioceptive state. So you're basically comparing your model with the state of the world, and you're kind of predicting errors, which then are, the system updates and fills in the gaps. The potent superficial to deep intercolumnar pathway conveys these expectations onto deep layer prediction units, which is accompanied by feedback connections from premotor cortex. So now we're involving premotor cortex into this, and we're getting more information, and we're correcting those movements. Those deep layer units integrate extensive synaptic input, which in itself may give rise to deep layer fMRI signals. Furthermore, on the basis of this input, proprioceptive predictions are generated and transmitted to S1 and thalamic somatosensory nuclei to inform proprioceptive perceptions. So this is the perceptual influence component of active inference. So basically what's happening is we have our model in S1, and then we have feedbacks. We have these different types of signals that allow us to have these feed forward and feedback signals. And those feedbacks, actually, we start with, so we start in M1 in the superficial layers, and there's some sort of prediction there with error. Then we go to the deep layers where that prediction is corrected in some way. And then we involve S1 and thalamic somatosensory nuclei. So there's a loop coming from other parts of the brain that are taking in those innervations before they reach M1. And they're being integrated into these feedback loops, which then allow us to do perceptual inference. So that's the way they kind of sell this. Within this framework, cortical spinal outputs constitutes these same proprioceptive predictions directed to lower motor neurons in the spinal cord. The distinction between motor output and proprioception thus becomes meaningless, as motor output and proprioception are two sides of or motor output and proprioception are two sides of the same coin. So this is really interesting. And they're going to talk more about the active inference interpretation. So let's move on to the last paper. I want to get to that before we go. This is, I guess this is a preprint pending peer review. This is, I don't think this is posted on the bioRxiv, but this is something I kind of ran across while putting this together. This is visceral afferent training in action, the origins of agency and early cognitive development. This is Andrew Corcoran and co-authors. The abstract reads, the fetal period constitutes a critical stage in the construction and organization of the mammalian nervous system. So this is, of course, we know this. There's these critical stages of, construction of these afferents, construction of these innervations, and, how the nervous system is constructed and how it gets its information in adult. In recent work, we have proposed that fetal brain development is supported by bottom-up or interoceptive inputs from spontaneous physiological rhythms, such as the heartbeat. So this is something where you have these, how do you kind of connect these things in development? And it turns out that brain development is actually supported in part by other parts of the body. So you get things like physiological rhythms in other parts of the embryo, like heartbeat and things like that, and it kind of feeds back to the brain and it furthers development of the brain. So there are a lot of, the shorthand here is that there's a lot of connectedness in later fetal development. And so this is where we get this, we can have these connections. If we don't have these connections, we may have problems. So here we expand this visceral afferent training hypothesis to incorporate the development of top-down or allostatic control over body states. So they're introducing allostasis here as this top-down control over body states. And this is this visceral afferent training hypothesis. So this is where bodily states are controlled by these top-down signals. We propose that the brain's capacity to actively modify and regulate the afferent feedback it receives through interoceptive and other sensory channels, is crucial for establishing basic forms of agentic control and grounding the distinction between the self and the other. So this is really during the later part of fetal development, the really early part of like where babies are born and they're kind of doing this, they're kind of figuring out the relationship between their self and other things in the world. So this is basic to the formulation of agentic control. So we further suggest that individual differences in the way these training regimes are implemented or disrupted might impact developmental trajectories in gestation and infancy, including the potentiation of neurobehavioral impairment and disease risk later in life. This analysis raises the important question of whether the deleterious effects of prenatal adversity, such as premature birth, can be mitigated via targeted visceral afferent training interventions. So these visceral afferents are really important for regulating the entire fetus, the entire baby as it's developing. There's this top-down allostatic control, so we know about allostatic control, and it just basically helps these bodily states kind of form and become a thing. So this is also, I think, maybe important for developmental AI, in that you have these connections that are not only kind of, we think of connections in terms of a neural network as being weights, but maybe they're more than weights. Maybe they're kind of like, permissive versus restrictive. And so if they're there versus not there, we're in a certain configuration versus in a different configuration, it can have large scale effects on the outcome of development. Okay, so yeah, Jesse had to go. Thank you, Jesse. And so that's all I have for that. I don't know if Morgan had anything to say about it. Any comments?
Yeah, sorry. What was the title of that again? I just haven't seen balanced steady state imaging in a long time. It takes me back.
Yeah.
And let me see. Sorry, I'm just curious who's doing that. That was oh, is this OSF?
It may be, yeah.
This was a technique that was originally usually fMRI is echoplanar imaging, which is just says something about kind of like the nuts and bolts of the sequence. Balanced steady state is a different way of doing it. Originally taken from cardiac imaging because it's super fast readout. So you can imagine trying to film the heart,
Right.
right? That you need to be able to capture a big 3D area really, really fast. And Carla Miller, who was in John Pauly's lab, Stanford, was the one. Like, this is going back to like when I started my PhD, so 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Was doing this, and I'm just curious in terms of the what else they have. I mean, it would be an awesome technique if you could get it to work, because it's because of its super fast readout, and so that and really really high SNR, and so she was doing some kind of I think it was at the time like visual cortex kind of stuff, but getting like sort of like structural resolution kind of millimeter cubic. Um, yeah. Anyway, I'll I'm interested to see who's actually doing that and how that's potentially connected to the vaso. But because vaso is a technique for actually capturing volume, and so again, like echoplanar, when people talk about fMRI, they usually say like epibold, and so they're talking about echoplanar imaging, and then this blood oxygen level dependent signal. That is a muddy measure that's made up of the oxygenation effect, the flow, changes in the flow itself, and then changes in the blood volume. And so the the people who really care about getting these kind of really quantitative measures where the you're only measuring one of those three, right? And so sometimes they'll combine like an oxygen, a bold with an ASL technique to try and catch two of those. Vaso's another way to do it. Anyway, there's just a bunch of technical things that I saw that would be really interesting. But if you were doing that, and that would be the way to do it at kind of like unheard of, or again previously unheard of kind of resolution and contrast to noise, if you will, in terms of what really matters in terms of the fMRI. That would be really remarkable, and then of course applying it to these particular domains would be super interesting. Layer fMRI, as like all the kind of research scanners, like locations, or all the research MR centers have moved to 7 Tesla. The ability to kind of using conventional sequences with some tweaks, they've been getting this kind of layer fMRI, and then some things that they do. I've looked at some packages for NeuroFedora in terms of just specifically getting kind of layer fMRI. But that particular technique would be, it's got a weird spherical harmonic signal issue. So it's like parts of the readout are good and parts aren't, and it has to do with this balanced steady state effect that is kind of, it's super physicsy, but like as far as I know, again, like I should check and see if Carla has new, she would be one of the first to jump on this if there was like any kind of new insights into how to manage that gradient artifact. But cool fMRI with a little active inference spin to it, and so I'll check the paper.
Yeah, I'll try to get the papers out too in Slack, maybe. That would be good.
Sure.
They're all interesting, I guess. Yeah, so that's good.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that discussion. I think it's an interesting set of things. It kind of discusses like sort of innervation and how that's important. Of course, it's embodied, but also it has this. It's basically how our nervous system communicates, and you can't just say like, I'm interested in what the brain's doing, or I'm interested in what the body's doing. It's this interconnection, especially in development, which is interesting because we don't, in developmental AI, that's one thing that people haven't really talked about is, okay, what happens if you don't have these. You have to have connections between parts in different ways. And
Yeah, it's funny. We had this dinner last night with a bunch of people. It was, host, like a kind of VC company hosted this neurotech dinner, but it's people from all these different kind of companies, right? And but this woman from Neuralink, it was just interesting. She was talking about the progress that they've had with these particular patients that, of course, have got these, severe damage, and this is allowing them to move. But I think one of the most interesting things we talked about was, if you could capture that in terms of development, like have these kinds of recordings during development. And just like how I mean, on one hand, like how interesting that would be for brain scientists, but also how challenging that would be. It's one thing when you have these adults, but what do you do? So one, the brain's always responding and is trying to generate kind of scar tissue around your implant and things like that. But in the case of kids, like their skull is changing too.
Right.
Anyway, as she said, they've got plenty of adults to work with for a long time now, and but it should be interesting. So. Well, I maybe next Friday, or at some point, we could use Fridays to start thinking about the GSOC to come.
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, thank you. Have a good week.
All right,
take
care.
Bye.